Sandy humbled every one of the 19 million people in the New York City metropolitan area, but it humbled some more than others in an increasingly economically divided city. Hours before the storm arrived on Monday night, restaurants, corner grocery stores, and hotels were open in the Union Square area of Manhattan. Instead of heading home to their families as the winds picked up, the city's army of cashiers, waiters, and other service workers remained in place. Divides between the rich and the poor are nothing new in New York, but the storm brought them vividly to surface. There were residents who could invest all of their time and energy into protecting their families, and there were New Yorkers who could not. Those with a car could flee. Those with wealth could move into a hotel. Those with steady jobs could decline to come into work, but the city's cooks, doormen, maintenance men, taxi drivers, and maids left their loved ones at home. What is class? All societies in the world rank their members into social strata or categories based on some set of criteria, such as money, education, employment, prestige, or power. Class systems are a form of social stratification based on a combination of birth and individual achievement. Social class is defined by certain factors, like income, education, and opportunities. These factors define an individual's lifestyle and their life chance, or the probability that they will be able to get what they want and need in life. This includes access to necessary resources, mitigation tools, and recovery assistance that can impact the vulnerability one can face in a disaster. Income inequality today can mean a world of difference in how one responds to impending risk. Preparing for, mitigating against, and responding to disasters or hazardous events in cities or areas with large vulnerable populations is a serious and ongoing challenge. Those with greater resources are able to achieve a higher level of personal and infrastructural security. While poverty is a problem in America, those defined as poor in the United States are very well off by global standards. Most of the poor in the United States and other developed countries experience relative poverty as well as a lack of resources compared to others in the same country. In contrast, people who lack sufficient means for survival suffer from absolute poverty. These people often live off less than $1 a day, a number unfathomable to even the most destitute United States residents. Across the globe, people struggle with social stratification based on class or caste every day. In the United States and other Western nations, we function under the idea of a class system, where social mobility is possible and people seek to follow the American dream. Many other nations work within the caste system, where social standing is inherited or ascribed at birth and is not connected with individual effort or achievement. While the caste system is more limiting and rigid, both ideologies embody the idea of separating individuals and families by a social ranking system.
Caste systems are a system of social stratification in which it's impossible to have social mobility. So caste systems have dominated historically in India and China, for example. And in a caste system, you're in the caste you're born into your entire life, and you die in that class. And so there's those have very strict systems of social inequality in which it's very hard to move, hard or nearly or impossible to move between levels.
Scholars widely acknowledge the impact of social class on disaster vulnerability. Recent disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy, indicate the differential impacts of disasters on certain communities, particularly those who do not have the means or resources available to cope with and recover from such events. Social capital, or the networks among people that foster and encourage mutually beneficial relationships and social cooperation, is one of the key components in disaster preparedness that is not available to people of all classes. In a disaster, important decisions about evacuation must be made quickly and often with little warning. Class and income inequality play a large role in determining whether or not evacuation is even possible. One's ability to prepare for a disaster greatly depends on whether or not they have the resources to do so.
So class is a complicated subject because class isn't just a single factor. It's income, education, occupation, and class affects someone's health, someone's housing situation. And so as a result, there's a lot of different factors that go into class. What ends up happening is it affects people in different ways because let's say your income is less than somebody that lives 3 blocks away from you. Chances are your housing situation is going to be less. Chances are your education might be less. And therefore, in a disaster situation, if your built structure is not as sturdy as someone else's based on your income, based on you being a renter instead of a homeowner, then what's going to happen is it might be more affected than other people's homes. In addition, if you have less education than someone else, then you might not respond to warnings in the same way.
Hurricane Sandy, which hit the East Coast in the fall of 2012, demonstrates a marked difference in the impact a disaster can have on the rich and poor. Within the state of New Jersey, for example, there was a significant difference in damage done to high versus low income households. As you travel along the Jersey Shore, you can see the housing damage and recovery efforts. In the 45-minute trip between Mantoloking and Union Beach shows the incredible difference between recovery abilities of rich and poor. Mantoloking is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the state of New Jersey. Union Beach, by contrast, does not come close to the average income or per capita wealth of Mantoloking. The drive between the two areas distinguishes the massive difference in recovery progress. Only 1 year later, the extravagant houses in Mantoloking are popping up along the still devastated coastline, while lower-class neighborhoods like Union Beach are still struggling to recover what was lost.
A lot of those people have had the house for a long time, since the 60s, and they got it from their parents, or they bought it,
So
they're
it
older
might
than
not have been
us.
a mortgage, didn't have flood insurance.
And they're being forced out, so it's going to be only wealthy people. There'll be no
gonna change
blue
the
collar. It's going to
demographic.
change the demographic of the shore. It's not going to be the same. There'll only be really rich people.
In the aftermath of a disaster, individuals of different classes are differentially impacted. Those with more resources, wealth, and social networks often have monetary reserves they are able to use. The wealthy have more elaborate social networks that are geographically wider and politically more powerful. Often, however, lower income individuals and their families live in close vicinities to one another, and a disaster that impacts one of them will usually impact the whole social network they have available.
Yeah, our town is over 40% of the people. It's second home, so they're not getting any assistance whatsoever. So a lot of they're walking away. Then they're giving $50,000
$50,000 grants for people to come and buy depressed properties that people are walking away from. So why not help the ones that are trying to stay in their homes, that are maintained in the community, like it's a second home, but we have renters which support the community. They have people going into restaurants and the beaches, taxi services, everything is supported by the people that we bring in.
Along the Jersey coast, a considerable number of the houses are second homes, the owners of which receive no aid from agencies such as FEMA. In many parts of the Atlantic coast, homes are inherited or were purchased many years ago for extremely low prices. Hurricane Andrew demonstrated the way social stratification impacted housing availability and preparedness efforts. Pre-existing infrastructure problems were exacerbated by the disaster event and illustrated the inequity between the higher and lower classes living in Florida at the time. Those with greater resources were able to afford better housing and felt the effects of the hurricane much less than those who had few resources to use in disaster preparation. Building codes in wealthy areas were much more stringent and well enforced than those in lower income regions. This problem was mirrored in Hurricane Katrina, where those who could not afford to reinforce their homes sustained far less damage than those who were not so fortunate.
We were in mainly the 9th Ward area, which is where the levees were and where the levees broke. And so the houses in that area were very, very low income areas. So there weren't a lot of people who were well off financially.
These codes and regulations are established by people with the power and connections to create political decisions. Policy planning has a huge impact on people through the disaster life cycle. Disaster warnings and evacuation plans come down to public policies, as do the plans for short and long-term recovery. Because these policies have such large impacts on the way disasters affect different individuals and groups, it is important to understand how they work and who is involved with creating them.
So in the U.S. system, the elite classes, in particular those near the top of the income distribution, as well as business and political elites, have the largest say in public policy making. They're most likely to be either part of the government themselves or have their voice taken seriously because they're more likely to do things like call their congressman or participate in political rallies or write letters.
The planning and policies a government creates to prepare for a disaster have a large role in the trust and faith the people will have in their government's ability to help them in a disaster's aftermath.
I know with Hurricane Sandy, there were emergency SNAP benefits. SNAP is the name for food stamps benefits that were issued to people so that they could replenish their stock that they lost. So there's definitely, if you have good insurance and you have resources, then you'll fare much better than those who don't.
If a government fails to warn the community of an impending disaster or communicates it in such a way the threat is not perceived as serious, the affected population will be made increasingly vulnerable because of this governmental failure. The incompetence of preparations for Katrina, especially at the federal level, is well known. A government's ability to inspire the community and convey the seriousness of disasters is vital in the preparedness process.
Our job is to bring in food from all sectors of the food industry, and then we would distribute it out. So we would have a conversation with the Red Cross of the Delmarva chapter of the American Red Cross, as they will really be spearheading all of the emergency response. We would also work with the governor's office to let people know where they can get food assistance. So we would definitely, in preparation, if a storm was to directly hit us, we would have conversations with officials from the Red Cross and ultimately the governor's office.
Overconfidence in government can also have a negative impact on individual preparedness. Even if community residents are aware of an environmental risk, they may believe that government planning and preparation are sufficient to handle a hazard event, and therefore they may feel less urgency to adopt household preparedness measures. Disaster preparedness is not only something to be enacted by the government. Individuals and households must take responsibility for constructing plans of action in cases of disaster. This planning and preparedness includes organized efforts at the community and household levels.
Socially and economically disadvantaged areas are particularly at risk because they typically don't have the access to the same kind of information networks. Most of us, now in developed and in affluent, countries and parts of the world, we carry around smartphones. We can get instant, text messages updating us all the time about warnings.
In addition, the poor are more likely than others to have substandard insurance. Among the poor victims of Hurricane Katrina, most lacked flood insurance, and those who had it would not receive sufficient reimbursement to rebuild without federal assistance. The response stage of a disaster is comprised of the immediate aftermath of the disaster and the surrounding circumstances. Social class may impact how people understand the information they receive, whom they receive information from, and the options people have once they understand the dangers. During warnings, social class plays a role in the perception of danger.
There's a lot of factors that play into it, from what one's housing situation is, in addition to what one's health accessibility is, or accessibility to health care, as well as one's education in terms of how to react in disasters, or just education in general. Someone with higher education is going to respond differently to warnings, to preparation in disasters than someone with less education.
Social capital is also important in disaster evacuation and preparedness. Inequalities in social capital increase noticeably over the course of disaster, from early preparation to prolonged displacement to uneven return, leaving the social safety nets of less advantaged residents increasingly frayed and ineffective over time.
I don't think we have to go too far back, historically. We would just look back to 2005 Hurricane Katrina, and that clearly illustrated the dichotomous burden and shift and the impact that storm had. I mean, the most vulnerable parts of the city were the most lowest lying parts of the Ninth Ward, were the poorest parts of New Orleans.
Recovery is defined as a reconstitution of the old community structure with a possible modification of personal and collective life. Recovery is achieved by the rebuilding of the physical environment as government institutions, schools, services, and businesses reopen and resume. After a disaster, oftentimes, the recovery stage would simply aim to quickly rebuild what was lost without creating any improvements to the areas.
There was actually one specific woman who I remember who we were helping. Her name was Miss Pat, that's how we referred to her as. And she actually was in a lower income area, and her house was completely ruined after the hurricane. And this was 2009, so it was about 3 years after the hurricane had already hit, and her home was still destroyed, and she had two different contractors come to her home to help rebuild, and they actually in total stole about $130,000 from her.
A pressing, short-term recovery need for the poor is housing. The ability to quickly move back into available housing plays a large part in the amount of recovery time. Poor families have a slower recovery rate due to their limited access to resources.
One of the real difficulties with temporary housing is that temporary housing tends to become permanent housing. So there are still examples all over the country, all over the world really, where temporary shelters, trailers, and parks have become full-time resident areas. So they're not always envisioned that way. And the infrastructure support and the support systems necessary to really make them thriving communities don't really exist.
Those with fewer resources may attempt to do repairs themselves or find a less expensive contractor who may not have the same skills as those selected by those with more wealth. Thus, even with some resources, those who are poorer may find the rebuilding process lengthier.
The insurance company was just giving him the runaround. Fill this out, or this is not good, that's not good. And so he was like, I got to get my family, get them stabilized, get kids in the school, I got to do something. And then he found out that the codes were being changed right where his street was, that their houses were going to have to be lifted up at least a foot, an extra foot. And he was like, where am I going to find the money to do that?
In recent years, both Haiti, a poor and struggling island nation, and Japan, another island nation, but one of the most affluent countries in the world, were both hit by powerful earthquakes. However, the way in which the nations responded was drastically different. The Japanese response to the earthquake was rapid, effective, and life-saving. Japan's legendary investment in earthquake-resistant design meant that only about 100 people died in the earthquake. Despite the fact that the earthquake was followed immediately by a tsunami and the collapse of a large nuclear power plant, the preparedness of the Japanese government and the resources available to them allowed the nation to extract itself from the disaster with fewer losses than Haiti. In Haiti, however, a weak government structure, limited to non-existent emergency preparedness, plan and management capabilities, and a large number of the population below the poverty line created a significant impact on the population. The government response to this disaster was slow and unplanned. Over 220,000 people were killed in the Haitian earthquake, and the country suffered an estimated loss between $8 and $13 billion, or 120% of the nation's GDP. Japan also had significant losses from the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear explosion combination, racking up damages of $360 billion and the most expensive disaster in human history. But the massive wealth and preparedness efforts of the Japanese government made the disaster seem much smaller by comparison. Differential effects of disasters can be seen within a nation as well. In the United States, the way a disaster impacts people can vary between states or even cities and towns. Although as a whole, the United States is considered an industrial nation with a great deal of resources and trust in the government structure, there are some individuals and families that fall through the cracks. Usually lower income individuals. These people illustrate how even a wealthy nation like the United States has room to improve in disaster preparedness and recovery planning. As we have seen, class and social inequality play huge roles throughout the disaster life cycle. An individual's social class impacts their ability to protect themselves and to procure needed supplies and resources when a disaster event occurs. With limited resources and power, the lower classes often do not recover or prepare for disasters as well as those with large scopes of power and social networks, affluence, and commodities unable to lower classes like insurance and backup supplies. Policymakers have incredible impact on disaster preparation, response, and recovery. These people have the power to provide aid and preparedness strategies to different communities and classes, but are greatly concentrated in the upper incomes and socio-economic classes, making the struggles encountered by lower classes less visible and less supported. Overall, disasters have very differing impacts on individuals and families in different classes, with those on the lower end of the spectrum facing considerably larger losses and effects. While disasters impact an entire region or nation without attention to class or income, this factor plays a great role in determining the impacts of such a disaster and how quickly, if at all, one can recover from that.